Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is a pro-revenge story. I worked for a company that manufactures specialized industrial automation equipment. I need to be vague about the exact nature of these machines to maintain anonymity. During my time there from 2021 to 2023, I built relationships with numerous clients who needed our machines installed and maintained. One of these customers was Alex. After I left the company for a different position in early 2024, Alex somehow kept my contact information. One Thursday afternoon in June 2024, my phone rang. It was Alex. "Hey, we've got a situation here," he said. "We need a new unit installed and another one needs maintenance. Are you available?" I explained that I no longer worked for the company, but offered to connect him with someone who could help. "Listen," Alex said, his voice dropping lower. "I'll pay you double your current rate to install it this weekend. The company has jacked up their installation fees, and honestly, we just can't afford it. Their instructions are practically gibberish, and our engineers are completely lost." After some consideration, I agreed. Some context. Installing these units typically takes anywhere from several hours to a full day working solo. The company offers two options: pay for their engineer to handle the installation, or save money by receiving instructions for the customer's own engineering team to do it. The instructions are notoriously complex, and company policy states that once someone starts the installation, they won't get involved since they can't verify if any components were damaged during the process. This detail becomes significant later. I arrived that Saturday morning and they showed me to the equipment boxes. The installation was going smoothly, and about 6 hours in, Alex appeared. "How's it coming along?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Almost finished," I replied, wiping sweat from my forehead. "Just need to configure the settings." "Yeah, about that." Alex shifted uncomfortably. "We actually don't have the budget to pay you. I know this is frustrating, but our engineers can take it from here." My blood was boiling, but I kept my composure. That's when I decided on my revenge. There's a hidden test mode button inside the unit that's used during maintenance. It's impossible to configure the unit while this button is pressed, and you can only access it with a pin. The button isn't mentioned in the installation manual because it's not meant to be touched during normal setup. There's no visible indication when the unit is in test mode. It just won't function properly. I discreetly pressed the button, gathered my tools, and left without a word. Monday morning, my phone lit up with Alex's name. I ignored it. I knew my old company wouldn't touch it since I'd already started the installation, and I knew his engineers would never figure out the problem. Let him sweat. After dozens of missed calls over several days, I finally answered. "Where have you been?" Alex shouted. "We've been trying to reach you for days. Nothing's working." "How is that my problem?" I replied calmly. "You refuse to pay me." "Look, I'm sorry, okay? We can work something out. Just please come back as soon as possible." "Sure," I said, "but it'll cost you $8,500, paid up front before I do anything." The line went silent for a moment before Alex exploded with profanities and hung up. The next day he called back, his voice notably subdued. "I apologize for yesterday. If you can fix this, I'll pay." "Payment first, then I'll come," I insisted. After some back-and-forth negotiation, he agreed. Once I saw the money in my account, I drove over the next morning. The look on Alex's face when I pulled out a small pin, reached inside the unit, and switched it out of test mode was priceless. His jaw dropped even further when I packed up my tools and headed for the door just 20 minutes later. "That's it?" he stammered. "That's it," I confirmed with a smile. "Easiest $8,500 I've ever made." Don't try to mess with a professional problem solver. The next one is an entitled people's story. I never thought I'd be that person who'd end up in a legal battle with their neighbor, but life has a funny way of surprising you. This is the story of how my peaceful suburban life turned into a 3-month nightmare involving property lines, water rights, and a neighbor who thought he could just take what he wanted. My name's Mike, and I've lived in my house in western Pennsylvania for about 15 years now. It's a beautiful 2-acre property with a natural creek running through the back portion. That creek was actually what sold me on the house back in 2008. There's something magical about having your own little stream, watching the water flow past while enjoying your morning coffee on the back deck. The property to our right had changed hands several times over the years, but we never had any issues with previous neighbors. That all changed when Robert Mitchell moved in last spring. From day one, something felt off about him. He never came over to introduce himself, which isn't a huge deal, but in our neighborhood, it's kind of an unwritten rule that new folks at least say hello. The first time I actually spoke to Robert was when I found him in my backyard, standing by the creek with a measuring tape. This was about 2 weeks after he'd moved in. "Can I help you with something?" I called out as I walked over. He barely glanced up. Just checking the property line. This creek's actually on my land. I nearly choked on my coffee. Excuse me? Yeah, according to the satellite view on my phone, this creek is part of my property, he said, showing me his phone screen as if that was some kind of official documentation. I think there's been a misunderstanding, I said, trying to keep my voice level. The creek is definitely on my property. I have the surveys to prove it. Robert scoffed. Well, we'll see about that. He walked away without another word, leaving me standing there wondering if I'd imagined the whole interaction. I immediately went inside and dug out my property documents just to reassure myself. Sure enough, the creek was entirely within my property line, serving as a natural feature about 15 feet inside my boundary. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 3 days later, I came home from work to find survey stakes hammered into my yard, creating a line that cut straight through my property and claimed about 20 feet of my land, including the creek. I immediately called the local survey office, and they confirmed they hadn't done any recent surveys in our area. Robert had placed these stakes himself. I took photos of everything and then pulled the stakes out. That evening, I wrote a certified letter to Robert, politely but firmly explaining that the creek was on my property and including copies of my survey documents. I requested that he cease trespassing and making false property claims. He never responded to the letter, but things escalated quickly. The following weekend, while I was visiting my sister in Ohio, my next-door neighbor on the left called me. "Mike, you need to get home right now," Sarah said, her voice urgent. "That new guy has a construction crew putting up a fence, and they're building it right through your creek." I nearly dropped my phone. "What? That's impossible. He can't do that." "Well, he's doing it. They've already put in several posts." I immediately called the police and asked them to stop the construction while I drove the 3 hours back home. By the time I arrived, there was a half-finished chain-link fence cutting directly through my creek, with Robert standing in his backyard supervising the work like some kind of feudal lord overseeing his domain. The police officer on scene was talking to Robert when I pulled up. I quickly parked and jogged over, property documents in hand. "This is my property," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I have all the documentation right here, including surveys from when I bought the house." The officer, whose name tag read Williams, looked through my paperwork. "Sir," he said to Robert, "without a current survey showing this is your property, you can't build this fence. You'll need to stop construction immediately." Robert's face turned an interesting shade of red. "I know where my property line is. I paid good money for this house, and that creek is mine." "Do you have documentation to support that claim?" Officer Williams asked. "I have the real estate listing that shows the creek in the property photos," Robert insisted, as if that proved anything. The officer shook his head. "That's not legal documentation, sir. You need to stop construction now, or you'll be facing criminal charges for trespassing and illegal construction." Robert stormed off to talk to the construction crew, who began packing up their equipment. I thought that would be the end of it, but Robert turned and pointed at me. "This isn't over," he said. "I'm getting my lawyer involved." I should have taken that threat more seriously, but I honestly thought he was just bluffing. The property lines were clear, the documentation was solid. What lawyer would take such an obviously losing case? Well, it turns out there are lawyers who'll take any case if you pay them enough. 3 days later, I received a certified letter from Davidson & Associates, attorneys at law, claiming that historical property records showed the creek was actually part of Robert's land, and demanding that I cease interfering with their client's rightful use of his property. That's when I realized this wasn't going to go away on its own. I called my friend Steve, who's a real estate attorney in Pittsburgh. "Send me everything you have," he said after I explained the situation. "Property documents, surveys, photos of the fence, everything. And Mike, don't talk to Robert or his lawyer without me present." I sent Steve everything that evening, and we met at his office the next day. He reviewed all the documents while I nervously watched from across his desk. "Well, the good news is your neighbor doesn't have a leg to stand on," Steve said, looking up from the papers. "The bad news is he seems like the type who'll fight this anyway, which means this could get expensive and time-consuming." "I can't just let him steal my creek," I said firmly. Steve nodded. "No, you absolutely shouldn't. Here's what we're going to do." Over the next few days, Steve put together what he called our shock and awe response. He filed for an immediate injunction to prevent any further construction, sent a detailed cease and desist letter to Robert's lawyer, and began the process of filing a civil suit for trespassing and property damage. But Robert wasn't done with his shenanigans. One morning I woke up to find him and two guys with chainsaws cutting down a maple tree near the creek on my property. I immediately called both the police and Steve, then ran outside with my phone recording. "Stop what you're doing right now," I shouted. "You're trespassing and destroying my property." Robert turned to face me, wearing a smug expression. "This is my land, and these trees are blocking my view of my creek." "The police are on their way," I warned him, "and my lawyer will love this video." "Go ahead and call whoever you want," he sneered. "I've got documentation proving this is my property." When the police arrived, Robert proudly produced a document that he claimed proved his ownership. It turned out to be a badly photoshopped version of his property deed with altered boundary descriptions. The officers were not impressed. "Sir," one officer said, "presenting falsified documents to law enforcement is a serious offense. Are you sure you want to stick with this story?" Robert's face went pale, and he quickly changed his tune, claiming it was all a misunderstanding and that he'd been given incorrect information by his real estate agent. The officers issued him a citation for trespassing and criminal mischief for the damaged tree. Steve was ecstatic when I sent him the video and police report. "This is perfect," he said. "He's just making our case stronger every time he pulls something like this." But the situation was taking its toll on me. I installed security cameras covering my entire backyard, and I found myself constantly checking them on my phone. Every time I heard a noise outside, I'd jump up to see what Robert was doing now. The stress was affecting my sleep, my work, and my overall peace of mind. Things came to a head when Robert decided to one-up himself in the ridiculous department. I came home from work one day to find him sitting in a lawn chair in the creek, fishing with a tiny rod like he was Tom Sawyer or something. "What are you doing?" I asked, completely dumbfounded. "Fishing in my creek," he replied without looking up. "Found some minnows earlier." "You do realize this is all being recorded, right?" I pointed to the security cameras. "And that you're violating a court order by being here?" He just shrugged. "Courts get things wrong all the time. This is my property and I'm exercising my riparian rights." I had to Google riparian rights later, but at the moment I just called the police. Again, this time they arrested Robert for violating the court order. He spent the night in jail before posting bail, and boy, did that make him mad. The next week, we had our first court hearing. Robert's lawyer, a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit, tried to argue that historical maps from the 1800s showed the creek had originally been part of Robert's property line. Steve was prepared for this. "Your Honor," Steve said, standing up with a stack of documents, "I have here the complete chain of title for both properties going back to 1875, when the original parcel was first divided. At no point has the creek ever been part of the defendant's property. Furthermore," Steve proceeded to systematically destroy every argument Robert's lawyer tried to make. He presented satellite imagery showing the creek's position hadn't changed in decades. Brought in an expert surveyor who confirmed my property lines, and even had testimony from previous owners of both properties confirming the creek had always been part of my land. The judge was clearly getting irritated with Robert's lawyer's increasingly desperate arguments, but the coup de grace came when Steve presented the video of Robert with his badly photoshopped document. "Your Honor," Steve said, "Mr. Mitchell has not only trespassed repeatedly, but has also attempted to present falsified documents to law enforcement. This entire dispute appears to be based on nothing more than Mr. Mitchell's desire to appropriate my client's property for his own use." The judge agreed. Not only did he make the injunction permanent, but he also ordered Robert to pay for the removal of the partial fence, the replacement of the damaged tree, and all my legal fees. The look on Robert's face when the judgment was read was priceless. But we weren't done yet. Steve had one more card to play. "Your Honor," he said, "given Mr. Mitchell's repeated violations of the previous court order and his attempt to present falsified documents, we're requesting the court require him to install, at his expense, a survey-accurate fence along the actual property line to prevent any future encroachment." The judge agreed to this too, meaning Robert would have to pay for a new survey and fence installation on the correct property line. As we left the courthouse, Robert tried to approach me, but his lawyer held him back. I heard him say, "Don't make this worse than it already is." The aftermath was satisfying to watch. Robert had to pay for professionals to remove the partial fence he'd installed through my creek, which wasn't cheap because they had to be careful not to cause environmental damage. The replacement for my maple tree was a significant expense. Mature trees aren't cheap. The new survey and fence installation along the correct property line cost him several $1,000s more. All told, Robert's attempt to steal my creek cost him over $50,000 in fines, fees, and required work. He could have avoided all of this by simply checking his actual property documents or hiring a surveyor at the beginning, which would have cost him maybe $500. About 2 months after the court case, a for sale sign appeared in Robert's front yard. He moved out 3 weeks later, never speaking to me again. The new owners are a lovely young couple who actually came over to introduce themselves and specifically mentioned that they'd checked their property boundaries before buying. These days I enjoy my morning coffee by the creek again, though now I have a clear view of a very nice fence marking the property line. The new maple tree is growing well, and the security cameras have stayed up, just in case. I learned a lot from this experience, mainly that some people will go to incredible lengths to take what isn't theirs, but also that standing up for your rights, while stressful and expensive, is always worth it in the end. Steve still likes to tell this story at legal conferences as an example of how not to handle property disputes. He particularly enjoys showing the video of Robert sitting in the creek with his fishing rod, which has apparently become something of a legend in local legal circles. The whole experience taught me the importance of keeping good records, installing security cameras, and having a good lawyer on speed dial. It also taught me that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting someone suffer the natural consequences of their own actions. As for the creek, it continues to flow peacefully through my property, unaware of all the drama it caused. Sometimes when I'm sitting by it, watching the water flow past, I think about how something so peaceful could cause such conflict. But mostly I'm just grateful to have maintained ownership of this little piece of nature that made me fall in love with my property in the first place. The story spread through our neighborhood, and now whenever new people move in, someone always makes sure to mention the importance of checking property lines. We've had no similar incidents since, though I notice people tend to be extra careful about where they place their fences and landscaping. I still have all the documentation in a fireproof safe, along with the court orders and judgment papers. You never know when you might need them, and if there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that you can never be too prepared when it comes to protecting your property rights. The next one is a petty revenge story. Disclaimer, this was about 7 years ago, so the conversations are summarized and not 100% word for word. I used to work in a call center where everyone had little cubicles. You could chat with people on either side or behind you if things got slow, but anyone on the other side of the divider was sort of hard to see or chat with. Only important because Karen was in this hard-to-see location from me. I have issues with overheating, medical stuff. I like to sit right under the AC vent. Nobody fought me for this because it was a little too cold for most people. Well, being a woman, this meant that sometimes I had some nipple pokey issues on some days. It's perfectly natural and to most people not noticeable because it was under my shirt plus bra. Karen notices this and makes a report to HR. HR woman and my direct supervisor parade me through the cubicles and into their office to question me about my nipples. Now, I could have thrown a fit about this to begin with since we didn't actually have a dress code and it's none of their damn business. They asked me to prove I was wearing a bra, so I showed them the straps. They told me, good enough, basically, and to go back to my desk. I refused to go back. I said I needed to place a complaint about someone. They asked me who I was reporting. I said, I don't know, but you do. I want to report whoever it was that's been staring at my breasts all day. Now that I know someone is staring, I feel like this is a hostile work environment. They acted like I was joking at first until I said, if you don't have a talk with them, I will go over your heads and report you for forcing me to reveal my bra to you. I got escorted back to my desk and Karen was sitting there looking smug, until they escorted her to the HR office instead. I don't know what happened to her in the office and I didn't care. They did their part by having their talk with her. All I really wanted was to know who did it. Since it was a very slow day, all my coworkers started asking me what that was all about. Office gossip, you know. I told everyone exactly what had happened, and added that Karen must be fascinated with my breasts since she noticed. Everyone else confirmed they didn't even notice. When she came back from HR, every person in the room knew what she had done, and was glaring at her. Snitches didn't get stitches and didn't get fired either, but they got treated like the Karen they were. Nobody would talk to her. People would be chatting, see her come try to join the conversation and go silent and turn away from her. Some people did loud whispers and made comments like, "Shh, don't say anything, she'll report you." She quit about 2 weeks later. The next one is a malicious compliance story. A couple of years ago, I worked customer support for an investment and pensions debt of a larger company. Basically, answer the phone and help customers who don't understand something about their account or need to access features usually reserved for their accountant. I had only been with the company about 3 months, had finished my training, and recently been cleared to take calls unmonitored. But a supervisor was still listening back to 3 or 4 of my calls each day, just to check. It was coming to the end of the tax year, so the lines were super busy, open to close, but a lot of the calls I was taking were for pension or ISA withdrawals or deposits, so all I had to do was check a few details, then drop the customer in the call queue for the relevant debt. Due to the high volume and relative simplicity of these calls, I was answering 20-30 a day. After a week or so, I got a message from my team leader telling me I was taking too many calls, so the number he was checking wasn't a high enough percentage to be indicative of my performance. Okay, fine. Starting the next day, I would take a call, pass the customer on, then sit and twiddle my thumbs for an hour, all while the queue is getting longer and longer. We're talking 2-3 hours on hold. Then take another call and repeat. Fast forward another couple of weeks, and I have a perforated review with my team leader. He says that my verification of customer identities isn't up to scratch with company standards. I explain that 1. I am meeting the standards that were laid out in our training and that all further advice and guidance had been completely contradictory or so vague as to be meaningless. He tells me that when I come in tomorrow, I need to log in, mark myself as in training so I won't receive any calls, and wait to hear from him about next steps. So the next morning I log into my work laptop and wait to hear from him. For 5 days, I sat in my spare bedroom office playing video games, all while logged in, marked as in training, and waiting till hear from my team leader. The next week, I get a message from a manager 2 or 3 steps above my team leader asking why I haven't taken a single call in 5 days. I explained what my team leader told me, sent screenshots of emails, etc., and said that I was waiting to hear back. She said she would look into the situation and get back to me. Cue another week of video games and naps on company time. I ended up getting made redundant and taking the balance of my annual leave before anything got resolved because the company outsourced 90% of the call handling to India, but those 2 weeks were great. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.